Welcome to the Traumadelic podcast. My name is Omar Farouk Chauhan, and I created Traumadelic Therapy to provide free mental health resources for viewers to learn more about mental health in the form of psychoeducation. In this podcast, you'll hear from licensed therapists who specialize in trauma-informed care as they break down how trauma is stored in the body. Please note, this is not meant to be taken as medical advice. Traumadelic therapy is not a substitution for psychiatric/mental health services or medication. If you are currently experiencing a psychiatric emergency and/or crisis, please dial 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline or 911 in case of a medical emergency. Thank you for tuning into today's episode and enjoy the podcast. What's up, everybody? This is Omar.
I'm Becca.
I'm Anna.
Oh, sorry. So we are licensed social workers. Today we are joined by my lovely partner, Anna Behrens, to help us provide a more of an outside perspective on all of our topics we talk about. This is the Traumadelic podcast, all about trauma, complex trauma, CPTSD, vicarious and secondary trauma. And Becca and I are licensed social workers who went through the same program. We're rewatching all of our lectures and trying to find a way to bring it down to a digestible, more of a easy, dissectable format for our audiences. So
yeah, this just basically provides you a lot of education on what trauma is, and hopefully it can help you. But on that note, we are also not your therapists.
Yes.
This is not medical advice.
This is not a substitution for your psychiatric medication or your psychiatric services.
If you are in need of help, just dial 988. It is the National Suicide Hotline, and they can help you out with some resources.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I forgot again.
One of these times, you'll remember.
So yeah, once again, we're going to be providing our perspectives on treating trauma, and we have a friend here to help us backtrack when we say things that you might not understand this time. So let's get to it. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the polyvagal theory, but before we jump into that, just like last time, we're going to go through some questions that we received and just clarify some of our talking points from the last podcast. So Becca here has some of our questions written down.
We had quite a few questions this time, and that kind of jump-started us thinking that this week we were going to maybe post like a Q&A, like an anonymous one in our socials, so that you can, if you want to, you can jump in with an anonymous question, or if you are listening to this like after the date has closed, you can always like DM or something like that, but we're going to know who you are. So if you're cool with that.
Yeah, we'll keep your identity confidential. If you want to reach out, you can reach out to @Traumadelic Therapy on Instagram. We are not on every social media platform just yet, but that will soon be a thing. So Traumadelic Therapy on Instagram.
TikTok too.
And TikTok, yes.
Yeah.
But I don't moderate the DMs for that often. So
okay.
Instagram might be your best bet.
Yep. So hit us up on Instagram. So one of our first questions is, what does our trauma response say about us?
So our trauma response is what they say about us. Well, okay, so I think like on a fundamental, right? Like trauma inside when it comes to, let's say that you're a 4-year-old and your neighbor is a 4-year-old, right? And you get traumatized at a certain point where it disrupts your developmental stage, right? On a fundamental level, like the same thing is happening, but depending on your culture, maybe your family values even, your societal identity, trauma can just present differently overall, right?
Yeah.
So it can say things about your identity. It could say things about your upbringing. It can say where on the spectrum of like rigidity versus flexibility you might be on as a human being, but really like it's such a unique concept for each individual, in my opinion. I think it's really hard to like pinpoint that into one sentence.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that it's really your trauma response isn't really something that you can control.
Yeah.
So what does it say about you? Not really a whole lot.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and if you keep in mind everything I just mentioned, like what it might say about you, they're all like social constructs, right? Like cultural values, family values, like these don't necessarily speak to you as a human being. They just speak to what we label maybe as good or bad, depending on the culture or the society.
Yeah. It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with your identity.
You get very nitpicky with that question. So
knowing what it is helpful, because then you can kind of start to identify
absolutely
when it happens or what happens when you're going that direction. But what does it say about you? Not really a whole lot.
It's a pretty good example of like, where do we cross the line between, or draw the line between labeling or hyper labeling, like pathologizing.
Yep, that's what I was gonna say, is like pathologizing personality, like we pathologize or like label people or diagnose people whenever they're just being themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question that goes along with that is, what causes us to choose the wrong trauma response?
I think you have a pretty good answer for that.
There is no right or wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's not anything that you can control. You don't really. Yeah. It's not that like fight or flight or whatever is wrong. It's what your body is going to do to preserve itself.
Yeah, 100%. Your what you do when you are in a fight or flight response, or hyper aroused emotionally, or in a triggered state, like we're going to go into this in the lecture today. You kind of get hijacked. Yep. You don't necessarily have much control. And these are, most importantly, like we said before, these are protective factors. These are things that keep you alive.
Yep.
Kept you alive.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Whenever you're hijacked, you don't really have control over yourself. So it's, you just cannot choose. You don't choose right or wrong. It just happens.
Yep.
Why doesn't CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're not familiar with that acronym, why doesn't it work for trauma?
I feel like I've been talking a lot. Does anybody want to take
that? I mean, sure. Yeah, I could do it. CBT doesn't work very well because trauma is, it starts in the lower part of your brain, like the more primitive parts. And CBT works on a higher level part of your brain, like the cognitive, or like the outer cortex, where you'd need a lot of like logic and reasoning and stuff to put things together. Whereas your trauma is not found in that place. You can't talk yourself out of like trauma responses, or like talk yourself out of, I don't know, the trauma that's stored in your body. It's more of a, just like, it's held primitively, like something that you can't control, something automatic, something that stores in your body, and you have to get to those parts. Whereas CBT gets to like, you talk about it, like how my emotions and my behaviors connect and stuff like that. Like you form pathways, but trauma is not like that.
Yeah. And if you've been paying attention, you've been keeping track of our episodes, we talked about this last episode where you have 3 parts of your brain. We're going to expand to 4 in this lecture, but we had 3 parts to your brain. You have the outer brain, your human brain. You have your limbic brain, which is your emotional brain, and you have your diencephalon part of your brain. But again, that gets splits off. But your lizard brain, basically your fight or flight response, right? Trauma is usually when you're being elevated. It's kind of like your lizard brain is taking over, right? You don't talk to your lizard brain, right? It makes decisions for you. And CBT is kind of like just talk therapy, right? Yeah. You're using logic and beliefs and frameworks to address behaviors, address cognitions about behaviors. And cognitions are usually a byproduct of a deeper trauma response rather than something you could just mess with on the surface for something that's traumatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember, I know you don't have it written down. There was one more question about whether we call PTSD anymore, or just PTS. I've heard about this idea about, we want to get rid of the word disorder. And I hear this about so many other diagnoses in the DSM, ADHD in particular, ASD, right? These things aren't a disorder. Disorder implies there's something wrong with your brain, right? It implies that something's wrong with you, when in reality, just the brain is operating differently. And in a trauma setting, your brain isn't operating differently at all. Like, this is a biological response. This is what we're primed to do when we're dealing with traumatic stressors.
Right.
So I like the idea, for sure, post-traumatic stress response. Are we there as a society that all psychologists and therapists are going to collectively just start calling it PTS instead of disorder? I don't think so. But I mean, I like the idea. I think this just speaks to the overall movement rather than just PTSD in and of itself.
Yeah, I get that. I get that people are trying to move away from pathologizing personality, or making people feel almost othered.
Yes.
100%. Like you're somehow damaged because you have PTSD.
Yeah.
But I also, like, whenever I read it, I think of like a stress response. Like 100%. I read it as a stress response, and it's like, okay,
yeah,
that's different. A stress response doesn't necessarily mean trauma.
Right, 100%. And that's kind of interesting. And I'm going to try not to diverge too much, but when we're posting some of our content on TikTok, a lot of people are commenting as if PTSD is a disorder you can just not catch, or maybe like
Yeah.
like as if it's ADHD, right?
Like you
But
get a cold and you get
right,
PTSD,
exactly.
like you caught
don't-
it.
they understand that PTSD happens after a traumatic etiology,
Mhm.
but instead of treating, we really don't look at as a society, we don't look at PTSD as a response, a biological, physiological adaptation to an external stimuli that's posing as a threat. People generally look at it as a mental health condition, like just a random, just it's up there with ADHD, BPD, whatever,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So like I really want to hone in on the idea and help people understand that anyone could get it. Trauma is not, it does not discriminate against
Right.
anybody. Like you no one's more immune to another person when it comes to trauma. Yeah, trauma is subjective for sure, in regards to your upbringing and your resiliency factors. But if you're in the right place, right time for trauma to strike and you don't process it, you don't not get PTSD, if that makes sense, if you don't get a chance to process it.
Yeah.
This could go into a long conversation. So I'm gonna stop
Yeah,
there.
I think that's what we always
Yes.
get onto and can rant about forever, is that like, because you had a stress response doesn't mean you're traumatized, but then also
Right.
Yeah.
So is there any more questions?
The last question that I was going to address, because our episode kind of like revolves around it, is dissociation. Just wanting to know more about it, but thankfully like our whole episode, because we're talking about polyvagal theory today,
Sure.
and that's gonna touch on dissociation, so let's like work through that through this episode and see if that kind of addresses that question.
Sounds great.
But again, if you have other questions that you are really curious about, remember this week we're gonna post anonymous spot for you to post a question if you'd like, and we're tossing around the idea of just having a whole episode devoted to answering questions.
Yes, that'd be wonderful.
That might be fun. So
before we go in,
go
I
ahead.
totally realized I forgot to do this. I wanted to give Anna's background, right? Or let you have a chance to speak her background, because I think her perspective and what she's an expert in can really like change the game when we look at how we're handling trauma and treating trauma on a macro level. I'll let you speak for yourself, because you know it better than I do.
Wow, thanks for the mic. Feel so loved. So as Umar said, my name is Anna, and I work in the nonprofit world. There are a lot of different types of nonprofit world, so I guess I'll get really specific and say 501c3s specifically. I'm currently tied to an education nonprofit working with some community colleges, and I guess I don't really have an educated background in trauma, but I'm working on helping students. And I think the beauty of community colleges specifically is that they're open to everyone. So we get a lot of people that are coming in, and I guess in just my relationship with you and friendship with Becca and getting to hear a lot about trauma at home, I realized that I'm dealing with a lot of people and individuals out in the world that have seen and experienced a lot of trauma. And it can be really difficult to get them that help or connect them to resources and ensure that we aren't just repeating the same cycle that they've been repeating their whole life. So I think a lot of interesting perspectives on how to manage and assist people in solving or working through their trauma, not only in a social work or therapeutic setting, but just how to give them some resources and assistance also just out in the real world as an individual trying to help them navigate life. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And we're thinking about having a future episode with her and actually talk with her through what does it look like to create trauma-informed policy. We had a little bit of training on that within our program, but let's actually see what it looks like when we apply it. So if you're still interested.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, let's just jump into it. And Anna, you just grab the mic from me if there's anything you want to clarify or you want to say something.
Let's recap our fight or flight response.
Yes.
We talked about this last episode, but just like really briefly want to talk like your lizard brain, that lowest functioning part of the brain, the one that develops first, is kind of responsible for switching on that fight or flight response and the fight or flight response is not anything that we can control. It's just something that the body does, right?
Yeah.
That's called the sympathetic nervous system. Outside of that is like the higher order brain. So we have two other levels, the emotional part, and then we move out farther where it's cognitive, where we can start to put logic and reason together. Those parts will shut down if the sympathetic nervous system is turned on. But whenever we realize like a threat is past and we don't need that sympathetic nervous system anymore, the parasympathetic turns on and we start to calm down.
Yeah.
Is that a good recap? Does that sound like everything we kind of touched on?
Does that make sense? Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. So now we're going to add another layer of complexity.
Yes. So
welcome to Polyvagal.
The Polyvagal Theory, it basically is we're going to be saying almost the same thing that we did last time, but it's a different theory. It's a different perspective. And I think it also adds more clarity and more detail to what we were talking about last time and how it applies in a real life, human, like day-to-day life type thing. If that makes sense.
Right. This polyvagal theory has a lot. I mean, look, we're still learning. We're always going to be learning. So we're going to fumble through this a little bit. Yes.
I mean, we are experts, right? But we're also like just starting out and we have a lot to learn, right? So
I'll tell you what I know, but I know that I'm going to continue to learn more about this.
Right.
So this is just the base.
Yeah.
Polyvagal has a lot to do with like social interactions and like facial expressions, like being able to read those a little bit better from other people as well. I know that there's
Get close to the mic. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I know that there's different parts. So this one has the sympathetic nervous system part as well. That's when fight or flight comes on.
Yes.
But to hone that down and like tamper it down so that we're able to function throughout life and like know that, okay, this isn't going to take over my life. That's when the ventral vagal. There we go. There we go. Ventral vagal system comes into play. It tamps things down and kind of like helps you navigate. You could
even like look at the ventral vagal system as like the default. Like this is where we want to be ideally.
Yep.
And we'll get into detail in a second.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then there's the dorsal vagal, which is like a key component in like dissociation.
Right.
So that's where that question can get answered today.
So I guess we can break these three sections within the polyvagal theory apart. Right. Real quick, polyvagal theory was invented or created by Dr. Stephen Porges. I don't remember what university he's in, but Porges if you want to search him up. Right. So the first section or the first stage, I guess, which I referenced should be the default at the very least, is called the ventral vagal complex. So again, this is kind of where you're utilizing your appearance, your facial features to show that you're calm, not because you're trying to show you're calm, because you are calm, right? This is where your heart rate is anywhere between 60 to 90. 90 is bordering like, trigger, but 60 to 70, maybe 80 is a sweet spot. This is where you're mostly regulated. This is where your lizard brain isn't kicking you into fight or flight. And things should be pretty chill at this spot. So the next part would be the sympathetic nervous system. This is where when your heart rate might jump to 100 to 150, this is exactly what we were talking about last week when it comes to fight or flight.
Right.
And
this is the same sympathetic nervous system that turns on in our last episode. It's just a different part of this theory.
Absolutely. And then so the theory also expands upon the stress response with the dorsal vagal complex. And as Becca was saying, this is kind of referencing and or like just kind of related to the freeze response, the dissociative response. This is when your sympathetic nervous system gets so overly responsive to such a massive threat. Like say, for example, you're being stabbed to death and you can't move. Your body will overactivate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your calming response. It's the one that puts all your adrenaline back, but it doesn't do it to calm you down. It does it to shut you down so you don't use as many resources while you're trying to stay alive. So what that means is your heart rate is going to go right from 100 to 150. It's going to go take that heart rate and bring it down to 20 to 50. This is where you're not really calm unconscious. You black out.
Yeah.
And this is where all of your blood flow goes to your hindbrain and your immune system. This is where clotting starts becoming more, I guess, quote unquote efficient. It speeds up. In the case that you do survive, your wounds are clotted up. And this is kind of like the last resort your body has to keep you alive. Ideally, you don't have to get there. Ideally, you're kind of bouncing between the ventral vagal, which is your default, and the sympathetic nervous system. When you get triggered, you can ideally regulate yourself back to the default. But sometimes trauma becomes a little bit too traumatic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So think about in dorsal vagal, whenever you're starting to shut down, your body is basically pulling all of your resources from the things that don't matter anymore to the things that it needs to turn on to survive. It's all it's trying to do is preserve itself. So does it need to logic and reason its way out of the situation? No. Does it need to clot your blood quick? Yeah, it does.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's trying to preserve you the best that you can. So that's what that system is going to do. So when things in the sympathetic response, like if you're fighting or flighting, if those things are not working, then the dorsal vagal is going to come on, because it's like, well, this is useless. I might as well shut ourselves down.
Yeah. And to paint even a more like detailed picture, the polyvagal theory references the polyvagus nerve.
Vagus.
And this nerve is connected to so many of your vital organs throughout your body. So it really, like, you can imagine it taking place from maybe like, I think it's like the tip of your spine or your brain all the way down to like your lower abdomen. I could be getting this wrong. I am not at all a physician. But it basically goes to show that this nerve is possibly, or maybe even definitely responsible for really reallocating the resources to which your blood flow is going to.
Yeah.
So if you need to I forgot what was the scenario that Dr. Vasquez was talking about when you go into dorsal vagal response, your freeze response, and you might end up pooping or peeing yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, because it is connected, but why does that happen again?
Yeah, he's talking about how primitive this response is, because he's talking about like how animals used to, like if they couldn't get away, they would just like
it's almost like a repellent.
Yeah. Poop themselves or pee themselves because they can't get away from the predator. And if they smelled like that, like the predator is seeking after them because they can get their scent. But then if they're pooping themselves or peeing themselves, then the predator is like, I don't like the smell of this. They must already be dead.
Yeah.
So then it like repels them.
Absolutely.
So that can still happen in humans too. If you're shutting down with the dorsal vagal, you could experience some of that, pooping yourself, peeing yourself, or sometimes people like vomit too.
Yeah, 100%. It's like you said, such a primitive response. It's probably one of the oldest response that was developed with your lizard brain.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know exactly where all the vagus nerve is, but here's in my notes it says it's everywhere in your body.
Yeah, right.
Don't know if that's true or not.
No, it did look like it's connected to your stomach, your liver, your lungs. So many different organs that are vital for your health. I also, quick note, do you remember in the lecture there was a section that Dr. Vasquez was talking about where do we know what myelin sheath is?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. You're reading my mind. That was the next thing I was going to say.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, myelin sheath is like a protective layer over your nerves, I guess. Yep. And it helps to either speed up the transmission of information, right, of neurotransmitters, and also like keep it more alive, like protect it almost.
Yeah, because once your myelin sheath, like it will start to deteriorate as you age.
Yeah.
And they think that could be possibly linked to like dementia, Alzheimer's.
Yeah, right.
So myelination is huge.
Right. And when you see, since like the polyvagal theory is kind of like referencing the idea of how the body regulates itself, how the body might not regulate itself through trauma, there might be a linked correlation to high trauma and a lower quality of myelin sheaths.
Yeah,
right?
I think that the vagus nerve actually has myelination
right, yeah, exactly.
on it.
Yeah. I think you're right. And what it was said here in the notes, I'm reading it right now, is that can be considered nerve damage, and that's what can disrupt the functioning of particular organs in your body, depending on how and when you were traumatized in your developmental stage.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So my question was, right, we talk a lot about trauma healing and how we can put things back if you have a really competent therapist or trauma healer or things that really address your complex trauma. I wonder, I don't think it'd be possible to undo that nerve damage though.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think like sure, yeah, you can get back on the right track or learn how to cope with some of these behaviors and things that you've learned because of the trauma. But this one is kind of like physical, and like once it kind of deteriorates,
yeah,
it's kind of, you can't really get it back.
Right. So yeah, I guess it might be a question for us to explore in future research.
Yeah, that what I had written down too is like the vagus nerve is like everywhere in your body, and because of if your sympathetic nervous system is turned on, it's kind of like coursing or like pushing cortisol and adrenaline through your body, and it's not necessarily good for you.
Yeah,
like cortisol can really start to deteriorate things because your body's working overtime.
Yeah, right.
And
it serves its purpose when when you're kind of in a regular stress response, quote unquote regular stress response, but overexposure to complex trauma will also create like an overproduction of cortisol, and like you said, deteriorates the body.
Exactly. So if you have an overproduction of cortisol, then it's going to start like tearing down that myelin sheath.
Yeah.
And it's also going to inflame your vagus nerve too.
Yeah.
So they think, maybe, we don't really know for sure because this is still relatively new in research. They think that possibly the vagus nerve becoming inflamed can cause like some gut issues or something like that, because you don't really want inflammation.
I remember our professor saying this is not a sign to go get your stomach evaluated for every stomach ache you get, right? It could just be a stomach ache. However, there, like you said, there is like an idea, a theory, or maybe like a concept that some stomach aches are probably just linked to the vagus nerve being damaged because it's connected to your gut as well.
Right.
So
interesting. Exactly.
Very cool.
So there's also this like fun thing where like the ventral vagal and the sympathetic like come on at the same time, kind of.
Yes.
And like if you think about like if you're trying to calm yourself down, but you're also trying to get yourself revved up to prepare yourself, like whenever you've gone through a lot of like trauma and you're just always ready for the next thing to happen, like you are keyed up, but then your ventral vagal is trying to bring you back down. They're both on at the same time.
We said this in the first or second episode, they should be in inverse. Like your calm default response and your stress response should usually never, not usually, it should really just never be on at the same time. One comes on and the other comes off. The other comes on, the other comes off, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a very traumatic response, I think what you're referencing is when the vagal system comes on, I guess, your heart rate just like drops so low, that's when you go into dorsal. But I don't know if that's where you were going with that.
I was going with like, if they're both on at the same time, you can imagine how keyed up you'd feel.
Sure. Yeah.
Like,
you're utilizing a lot of resources.
Yeah. You
sense.
have like a short fuse and you're probably really anxious. And then it also leads to like depression and not like, I know we heard it's not like the I'm sad or type.
Oh,
it's like I'm exhausted.
Yes. This is a good example of this is burnout, like chronic stress from work, from school, from even things that might be considered as complex trauma, right? Because you are always on. You're always on the edge.
Always on. Yeah, always prepared. And that can lead to like you don't have an interest in things that you used to like because you're so tired. You don't have the energy to do it.
Yes.
So that's kind of where you can see some of those symptoms of like anxiety, depression, hardly any motivation, or like even body pains because you're always keyed up and prepared.
Fatigue.
Yeah, that's where some of those things can come in and look like other mental illnesses, but it actually is because of this trauma.
Yes. And usually this happens because of the stress, the accumulation of stress. Ideally, what you could be able to do, you start your day off in the ventral vagal, your calm default state. You go to work, you deal with the stressor, right? It starts triggering your sympathetic nervous system. you go into a heightened fight or flight, and because your fight or flight is up, your ventral vagal comes down, or like your parasympathetic and or like your calm state is going down, and you're hijacked or you're triggered to deal with the stressor. The stressor is eventually over, and that should eventually come down, and your parasympathetic nervous system comes back online, and it puts you back in the calm response, or the ventral vagal system or the complex comes back online. The problem is when you don't process it over time, this becomes accumulated. It adds up, and you're kind of always in the sympathetic nervous system response, and that's what creates burnout, overwork. Then you go into work the next day, you are no longer really just calm default, you're already on edge. You're already going into your sympathetic nervous system because of the fact that you're expecting a fight and you haven't really processed the fight that happened yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can only imagine how much this whole idea or this concept negatively impacts most Americans in a society where we overwork our employees, overwork our teachers, our essential workers, our family members, kids even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think a question that I got was about schools too. Like, and this is a good example here. Like, imagine that a kid is going through some of this where like the trauma is kind of like compounding and they're always keyed up.
Yeah.
Like, this is where the polyvagal theory can come into play, because you can see it with their facial expressions. Like, clearly the heart rate is up. They're bouncing around. Like, they're not present. Yeah. So if they're a kid in a school, they're not going to learn anything. Right. And this, like, when they're keyed up like this. So it's important for educators maybe, or whoever is helping in the classroom, to recognize that and maybe spend some time doing like somatic exercises, calming down, deep breathing, or addressing those issues first. Yes. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to be in a power play, usually, like trying to get the kid to comply. The kid can't comply because the kid isn't. They're elevated. They're elevated. Yeah. They're not using the right part of their brain to get themselves to calm down. They're going to look
at, I guess, languages of violence, which could be coercion, restraint, etc., as a threat, which it is a threat to your primitive brain.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember in the lecture, it was saying like the reason why we do this, the reason why we lower our heart rate down to like 60 or 80 or whatever when we're trying to calm ourselves down, is because that brings us back into the ventral vagal complex. That brings us back to the calm response. And when you're there, your triggers, your traumatic symptoms are either neutralized or at the very least lessened, right? And yes, they could get lessened and you could get triggered right back up depending on your heart rate variability and depending on how traumatized you are. But the idea is if you can stay in the 60, 70 BPM heart rate area in that ballpark, then your trauma responses will be lessened.
Yeah.
It'll be easier to deal with.
Yeah, we say like if your heart rate is low, 60 to 70, it's almost impossible to have a trauma response.
Yeah, because you have to spike.
Yeah.
Your heart rate will spike automatically. You don't control it.
But. Right. I had some. I know we should probably address dissociation, because we talked a little bit about hijacking and stuff.
Sure.
I had some examples from our favorite Dr. Perry. This is in his book, and I just highlighted a few sections, so bear with me. It says, in dissociative states, as we've discussed, people can become so disconnected from reality that they move into a dreamlike consciousness where nothing seems real, and they feel little emotional or physical pain. So they're not really like feeling anything whenever you're in a dissociative state. These experiences are linked with the release of high levels of opioids, the brain's natural heroin-like substances that kill pain and produce a calming sense of distance from one's troubles. Research on rodents has shown that when these animals are totally restrained, a highly stressful experience for them, their brains will flood with natural opioids, and known as endorphins. People who suffer life-threatening experiences often describe a sense of disconnection or unreality and numbness that is similar to what people feel when they take opioid drugs.
Wow.
Interesting, right?
Let's unpack that.
I know. I have one other one, but let's unpack that one first. They both have to do with this idea of the brain releasing something like an opioid.
Yeah. Would that count as the dorsal vagal?
Yeah,
response?
like whenever you like shut down, your body doesn't want you to feel it, it's preserving itself. So it's like, hey, have this heavy dose of drugs.
Right. Basically. And I remember we were talking about in class how like, it really just depends on accessibility and what you come across first. People who end up cutting themselves not for the purposes of wanting to off themselves, but for the purpose of exactly what you're saying. It releases endorphins. It kind of calms you down, right? Those people would have the same responses if they were to find heroin on the streets. So the people who find heroin most likely just discovered that heroin does for them what cutting would otherwise have done for them, what should have been done from their caregiver, like, really just help regulate. But because they didn't have access to that, they jump straight to, they have an experience to jump straight to the hard substance of heroin or an opioid. Vice versa, right? If you start cutting yourself and you wouldn't need access to heroin, you just stay cutting yourself too.
Yeah, well, because whenever you're in dissociative states, your brain is shutting down, so you can't feel the pain.
Right.
So then if you're cutting yourself whenever you're in a dissociative state, or you can almost start a dissociative state by doing that, because that your body just shuts down.
Absolutely.
But whenever you're doing that, your brain is like, oh, cool, here's a little burst of some drugs.
Yeah, because imagine
feels
like
good.
And this goes right back to the first question about when do trauma responses turn wrong?
How do you what causes us to choose the wrong?
Right. So this isn't wrong or right? Like this is like your body. Imagine your shoes in the place of someone. You're in the shoes of someone who's experienced so much complex trauma, so much emotional pain, so much hyper dysregulation, to the point where you can't sustain that anymore, right? You would crave the idea of just quieting your brain, calming down so deeply to the point that cutting or self-harm or going out and finding a substance is your last option. It's your only hope, right?
Yeah.
So again, this is a protective factor.
Absolutely.
Right? Yes, if you want to talk about long-term harmful physiological effects of engaging with these types of maladaptive behaviors, sure, but a traumatized brain is not primed to think about that. Your lizard brain isn't primed to think about what's going to happen 20 years from now.
Well, it's exactly what we're saying, where you're like keyed up, where you have both systems on at the same time. You're going to feel like shit.
Yes.
You're going to feel really anxious.
Yes.
So like any normal human would be like, I don't want to feel like this.
Right.
Dude, this heroin makes me not feel like this.
Exactly.
Maybe that's an extreme example.
Exactly.
Maybe they go into, I don't know what kind of drug use first. Maybe they try something and they're like, wow, this really helps take the edge off, because I always feel keyed up.
Yeah. So just so for people who don't know what these things feel like, I myself don't, but when it comes to, but I do know what dissociation feels like, right?
Yeah.
I know what it feels like, and I'm sure most people in this country or around the world can relate in their own way, know what it feels like, that when your day or your days or your months become so stressful, you just check out.
Yeah.
Your kids are trying to talk to you or your friends trying to talk to you, you're not there. You're not present, right?
Yeah.
It's because your body's made a decision for you. You're so, again, overly, your different systems are so overly active, like you just kind of just whoosh, check out. And so just like it automatically makes a decision for you, it almost is the same amount of necessity that forces a drive or a motivation to pursue other maladaptive coping mechanisms, like taking a substance, like self-harm, right? It is the same thing. You're almost not making that decision for yourself.
Yeah.
So it would be quite, I guess, ableist to say that, they just need to suck it up. They're bad, putting a bad moralistic value to someone for having that type of response, when you yourself might be doing the same thing, just in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's a bunch of different ways that you can, like, it's not just drugs, people use a lot of things: drugs, food, sex, like lots of things.
That's where I was actually going to interject and say we've used some really extreme examples here, but I'm assuming that there are like people that can relate, maybe not to those extremely maladaptive coping mechanisms, but maybe just like the everyday stuff. Like the things that popped into my head were, when someone is talking with me at work and they're like, I was up until 3 a.m. watching Netflix and I just couldn't shut it off, even though I knew that I had to come into work at 7 a.m. the next day. I'm like, ooh, you might be dealing with something that you're coping not so great, because, anytime that I'm up at 3 a.m. watching Netflix, that normally means I'm in some deep avoiding, definitely dissociating.
Yeah, and sometimes people just like want to watch Netflix, and sometimes people are actively dissociating.
Yeah. Not to say that everyone watching Netflix until 3 a.m. is in some really deep avoidance and like dissociation, but I feel like probably a lot of people can relate to like you're really dissociating, and maybe you haven't turned to a hard drug or self-harm in that way, but I think technology, like scrolling on our phones and staying up late watching shows, especially when you do it in an avoidance because it feels good.
Yeah.
It's like that that every time that you can click it on and not have to think about what's happening. Or I think especially with burnout, you see that a lot just in everyday life, is like it's really easy to watch that next episode and not think about all of the difficult stuff that you're having to deal with.
Absolutely. That's a really good point that we were talking about too, is like everybody dissociates. They use this a lot because it works really well. Like I think every person ever on the world has dissociated at one point in time or another. And the difference between like dissociating or like what we call doom scrolling, which is dissociating, or
love me a good doom scroll every once in a while.
It's a response to trauma. Sometimes doom scrolling, maybe it's not. Maybe you're just having an overwhelming day and your emotional tank is just at capacity and you just can't take any more, and so your brain's shutting you off. But whenever it's a response to trauma and you realize that whenever things that are really stressful because you've been through some stuff before pop up and you start to just like check out and you're losing minutes, hours, whatever, or something's happening where you're dissociating and it's like impairing your social life, it's impairing your work life, like that might be something that you need to address. So is all dissociation bad? Probably not. Like your brain does need a break. Yeah, it's a protective factor. Your brain needs a break sometimes. And it's telling you like, I'm full, we're gonna check out. But sometimes when it's a response to trauma and it's interfering with your life, it might be time to like address that trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we've been saying, these are all protective factors. And thank you, Anna, for bringing that point up, because we want to make this material as accessible as possible, right? Maybe the concept of a more subjectively extreme maladaptive coping mechanism isn't something you could relate to, but like you were saying, you can relate to what it feels like to check out on your phone, whatever.
Yeah.
That is, again, an example of how stress responses can be so subjective to your experience.
Yes.
Right? Now imagine your phone, your mind-numbing, your Netflix isn't anything else that could work. It's only self-harm. It's only substance abuse.
Yeah.
I just wanted to like normalize that type of like human experience, because
I agree.
Nobody goes out of the way and be like, oh, I'm going to self-sabotage today.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And self-harm, like whenever people are engaging in self-harm behaviors, it's a lot different than what most people would think, if they've been through some traumatic stuff, they can't feel it. It's not like you and me, if we were to cut ourselves, I'd be like, that hurts, right? No, they don't feel that. Right. And for them, like for me, I'm like, oh God, that hurts. Know, like I might get a little adrenaline bust or so. I don't know. But for them, they don't feel it and they get an opioid release.
Right.
Like
it's the same way as like, if someone's hyper regulated, say that someone is like really good about time management and they try to like go on some mind numbing platforms, like they might be overly sensitive to the sounds, the ads. I don't know if you guys ever could relate when you're like super stabilized and the noise is just too loud. Like I can't deal with this right now because like you're so present, right? That would be the same thing as you're saying, as when we can't really relate to being able to calm down when we're cutting ourselves, because our subjective experiences keep us regulated at a specific I guess, at a specific point in our lives. I don't know how to say that.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm making sense. Did that make sense? I don't know.
I'm lost.
Okay. So I was gonna say that our experiences are so unique that I can't relate to what it feels like to calm myself by cutting.
Mhm.
Just like someone else might not be able to know what it feels like to relate to someone like scrolling mind-numbingly on social media, right?
Yeah,
So
like they won't get the same effect or whatever,
right,
you know?
exactly. And or they might not even need that effect. Maybe they're super regulated.
Yeah,
right,
but
in
even
that
if you're
moment.
regulated, you're probably doing something to keep yourself
Just keep yourself
regulated. Yeah.
100%. So yeah, all I was trying to say, we all have our own coping mechanisms. We
Yeah.
all have our own responses. And it's hard to relate to some of them, but again, we're just humans navigating this
Yeah.
world full of stressors and trauma.
I think it's mostly just like an exercise in compassion, knowing that
Yeah.
people who cut or people who use substances or whatever, there's a reason that they're doing it.
Yeah.
Like we said originally, all behavior is
Is a form of-
communication.
Yep.
Yeah. And
Yep.
this is communicating that like I'm hurting and I
Yeah.
need something to
Yeah.
help me.
I don't need to be yelled at. I don't need to
I
be
know.
punished for something that I'm already punishing myself for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it goes to say that anytime that we're judging someone or society is judging someone, I should say, for these what we deem as like maladaptive coping mechanisms, I don't think anything is going to be fixed by us coming in and saying, you're doing it all wrong. You're actually numbing in a horrific way. I'm sure they know.
Yeah.
Like, that's not doing anyone any favors. And I
No.
really think that's where my day-to-day comes in. People love to look at, a student, for example, that's like really struggling and has dropped a class 3 times and to say to them, like, you're doing it all wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that student or that individual already knows that they're really struggling.
Yeah.
No amount of telling them that they're doing it wrong or telling them how they need to be doing it is going to fix that situation.
Right.
Same thing with disassociation and
Yeah.
maladaptive coping mechanisms.
Right. Yeah.
Imagine like being mad at someone for an autonomic response, right?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not in control of when I get dissociative.
Right.
And like this, I want to touch on this and hopefully not stay on this too long because I could go on about this too. But like it really brings in the topic of the relationship between a trauma response, and one's sense of shame.
Mhm.
Shame is a really great way to keep trauma stuck in the body.
Absolutely.
It is such a
It's a powerful emotion.
yes, it is. I would even say it feels like a physiological restriction.
It does.
Right? Like imagine you are a growing vessel, a child, whatever, who needs nurturing,
Yeah.
right? And the moment you do something to express yourself, it is met with punishment, right? So say
Right.
that it's something as benign as maybe like spinning in circles or whatever, or dancing, right? Dancing is a really great way for body movement therapy to help get trauma out of your system, by the way.
Mhm.
So say that you get made fun of for how you dance, right? I'm totally projecting here, right? Like there is, if you have a lot of trauma in your life, especially, like it'll kind of cling itself to like to your perspective on the world that is based on trauma. And if there's shame there, it almost acts like a physical restriction. Like
Yeah.
you are imposing like boundaries within the brain's psychology, within the mind psychology of what the being is capable of or not capable of, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Mhm.
So like what you're doing when you're I guess talking down at someone who's using a maladaptive coping response is inducing shame, right?
Yeah.
And they already have shame. Like
Yeah,
just
they're carrying it.
There's already societal shame there.
And their own personal shame.
Right,
Like
right.
they don't feel good about doing it.
You're creating so much of a restriction in the idea of them being a human being, of them being able to look at themselves as a human being. Therefore, it triggers them back to once again utilize the maladaptive coping mechanism. You're reaffirming why they're using those maladaptive responses.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also, and I mean, that's a really great example for adults, but when you guys were talking about earlier, elementary students, when they're getting really heightened and like a teacher telling them, like calm down, or we could even use the example of like, I feel like they did this a lot in my elementary school, like the green card, yellow card, red card, like, and
Yeah.
then the minute that kid might get into like fight or flight or something, and all of a sudden you're giving them like a red card, you're just inducing shame at such a young age. And
Yeah.
I mean, so many things that just compounds, and by the time they're into high school or looking at college. And now that, you have a lot of kids, I think, that say, oh, I hate going to school. I hate education. And you have to wonder, like, does that tie back to the fact that that kid was in like fight, flight, or freeze a lot in elementary school and was just getting that red card every day for trying to cope and manage?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot to think about there, I think.
I also wouldn't like a system that constantly punishes me for something I'm not in control of, right? So
weird.
yeah. Anyways, sorry to diverge.
No,
but
something else that I was thinking about, because we were talking about kids and stuff, is we were talking about like neglect in babies and stuff like that.
Oh, yes.
And it's not, babies still have this response system. It's not like it just develops and you're 12 and now you have it. No, you have this from the get-go. Right.
This goes back to what we were saying before, whether or not babies were born. I couldn't remember if babies were born with the limbic system or not.
Oh yeah,
And this other theory that we might touch upon real quick about adult versus childhood trauma, the neurosequential model, I think it's called.
That's from Dr. Perry.
Right?
Yeah.
It looks at how babies, not only is their lizard brain fully functioning, but parts of their limbic brain, or maybe their diencephalon, which we'll get into at a later date.
Yeah.
Anyways, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, so we're talking about babies being neglected and how that affects maybe this whole system. So these babies still have this system. So like think about whenever they're hungry, like they have the sympathetic nervous system come on, and what it does to get the food is to cry.
Yeah.
So if it keeps crying and the calls for help go unanswered, it's going to start the dorsal vagal, it's going to start shutting you down, because it's like, you know what, we got into fight or flight. It's not our things that we're doing here are not working. We're going to shut ourselves down.
Yes.
What can happen for that kid is that they probably won't engage in help seeking behaviors after that.
There is no template for it, right? There's no foundation.
Yeah, because like they learned that the crying didn't work.
Right.
So from here on out, they're like, well,
yeah,
I guess I can't really depend on anybody.
When babies get into a hyper aroused state, right? Whether they're hungry or they need their diaper change, or maybe there's something that's hurting in their body, like you said, their immediate response is to start crying. That in an ideal situation, like they're going to be doing that thousands of times within the first 3 years of their lives, right? Pre-verbal, right?
Yep.
No memories being formed, and ideally the caregiver can respond to them as much as they can, right? No one's superhuman, but that informs the baby that I am taken care of. I am I am being responded to when I cry out for help.
It kind of like forms their cognitions of the world early on, like I can depend on people, and when I cry people.
The world is safe.
The world is safe.
Right. You start seeing that familiarity in other people if that's what your foundation is based on. And yes, crying for a baby, it uses up so much resources. If you see a baby that is relatively healthy when it comes to their central nervous system and their responses related, their face gets red. They start bawling.
Yeah.
They are like utilizing all of their energy to cry out for help. But like you said, when they are severely neglected to the point where they start learning that crying doesn't help, that's when, like Becca was saying, your dorsal vagal response, or dorsal vagal complex kicks in, shuts you down, because what's the point of using all those resources if you're not going to get what you need?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I have a side note and a really interesting thought listening to this, because I am clearly not in this field. I was just thinking, like babies that are well taken care of and they really like throw all of their resources into crying, and they know that they're going to probably receive that love, care, affection, nurturing that they are asking for. I would think then, how when kids are really little, if they fall, they're not really hurt, just a little fall, and they do the little like fake cry almost. Do you think that kids that are well nurtured are the ones that are doing the fake cry because they've created this like turn on switch in their brain that's like, if I create and elicit this reaction, I then receive my nurturing?
My initial response would be yes. Because it's like, that's how I get my mom. That's how I get my mom or my caregiver. I guess I don't need to specify the gender, but like, this is how I get my caregiver's attention, and this is how I get their love or whatever it is. Like, it worked for me.
Yeah.
But some other kids who don't have that, they don't do that.
Yeah.
And you can imagine how they grow up in adulthood. They're not asking for help because I'm not going to get it. And I'm going to grow up and know that the world isn't safe and that I can't depend on anybody else to help me.
I know. I just think about, I was thinking about, I have a really big family on my dad's side, right? And lots of little like second cousins running around. And you just see all of them the minute that something happens, even slightly, there's not even real tears elicited, but I'm like, okay, my cousins must be caregiving pretty well because these little kids, before they can even talk and form memories, the minute something slightly small happens, like they bring on the tears, the waterworks, immediately comforted. So
Yeah, exactly.
I guess that's a good thing to think about.
I do want to bring in another variable here, though, right? Because I genuinely don't know, right? To the answer to your question, right? Because what you're saying makes sense, but how does this relate to the concept that when when a toddler falls, right, and they're not hurt, and the caregiver's response to the child will really dictate how they're going to react to their fall, right? Like, remember how we talked about that in human behavioral class that we had? That like when a baby falls, they first look around to see what's your response as a caregiver before they know when to cry or not. If the caregiver responds with distress, "Oh my God, are you okay?" and starts kind of getting worked up, the baby will feel that, and the baby will start realizing, "Oh, I am hurt. I have to cry because my caregiver is like referencing that for me." But when the caregiver responds, it's like with a calm, collective manner, and like, "Oh, you're fine," like, just kind of laugh and the baby will start laughing.
But the caregiver is also there in both of those examples.
Right. That is true. That is 100% true. Right.
So if you're not responding to any of the cries and you're not responding to even the baby's existence,
right,
then they shut down.
But also, like, for a very nurturing caregiver, like your first time falling, the caregiver might not be there, but it's not just that one experience, it's thousands of times. It's more about like their first exposure to the caregiver's response. I guess that's related to detachment. But I was also going to say, though, that I wonder if the caregiver responding to the baby's cries also depends on the quality of regulation within the caregiver. What if, like, when you're crying, say that you're a toddler, and when your caregiver came to you to change your diaper to whatever, are they responding in a way that validates it reaffirms that you should be crying, or is it kind of there as a point of resilience?
Well, there's definitely some differences in the way the caregiving is presented, because remember that if you have a caregiver that is traumatized themselves and maybe has a lot of depression or fatigue, or like they just don't have a lot of motivation, that can imprint on the child. Like they're not as expressive, and they're not as attentive, and they're not as engaging with their child, and that can stunt development too. So I think you're on the right track, where it's like the response of like the actual caregiving itself can definitely have a big like impact on the kid, right?
I think, the biggest takeaway from this really long tangent that I have taken us on, I'm sorry, I think I'm supposed to be here to help keep us on track. I'm clearly not good at my job, but I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of a reliable caregiver.
Yeah.
And the importance of self-care amongst the caregiver. How are you going to be regulated caregiving for your child when you are not taking care of yourself?
This is a good transition, though, into mirror neurons.
Oh, yeah, 100%. There was one more thing I wanted to add.
Okay,
but it's gone.
We'll shelf the mirror neurons for a second.
It's gone. I'm saying there was something I wanted to add, but it's I can't remember it.
Okay, well, we can just briefly, if it comes back, we'll get back to it. But
that's what I'm gonna add. I was gonna say temperament, right? Like, these examples we're giving, these are based off of theories and like well researched data, but again, like, humans are so unique. There's so many variables that we don't even know about that contribute to a child's response, to a caregiver's response. So this isn't the only framework, or this isn't the only information that you need to know, right? In regards to responding to a traumatic response for your child or whatever. There's so many different variables.
Yeah.
And you should not take anything I say with a grain of salt, because I am not even a licensed social worker. I'm just chilling over here with my master's of public administration. So just a little disclaimer.
Yeah, but I think that's what helps, right? Like, we are coming with all this information that we learned from our trauma specialization program. I think someone from the outside, as well as our experiences with our clients, can really give us a clear understanding of like, what does this look like when we apply it to real life?
Yeah,
right? Because theory doesn't always translate well.
Because
to
real life has a lot more variables.
100%.
Temperament, attachment style. Like it's not just if you don't respond to your kids cry once that now they're damaged forever. It's like, look, you're doing the best you can.
Right.
If you do the best you can more times than you don't, you're good. Yeah. Hopefully.
Absolutely.
Mirror neurons.
So cool.
That's whenever you're talking about like taking care of yourself as a caregiver, you can't calm your child down if you aren't calm yourself. It's because of these freaking mirror neurons.
Yeah, that is one of the proposed hypothesis, right? Because mirror neurons exist, right?
Absolutely.
But the idea of like how we so empathetically connect with how you're feeling as another human being is still kind of a mystery, right? Like, this is where like science refuses to go into spirituality and get into more Eastern philosophies or South American philosophies, right? But, you can generally, like, if you're really in touch with your body and your environment, you can tell the vibe of a room walking into it, right?
Yep.
Mirror neurons are a proposed hypothesis for why that is, but mirror neurons outside of that context absolutely do what you're about to say they're going to do. So
yeah. No, I get what you're saying though. Cause like in session with my clients, like I can feel their energy right away because of that emotional connection, I can feel their emotions for them before they feel it, which is so weird. And you cannot,
very interesting.
You can't study that. You're just going to have to think it's a little like hippy dippy because it is.
So why don't you explain to us what mirror neurons are and what role they might play in what we just described?
Yeah, mirror neurons, I'm going to make it super basic. They're just neurons that mirror another person. Like you're going to like project onto another person what you're feeling on the inside. So think about a kid who's really upset or whatever, angry, whatever's happening. They're upset. If you're upset too, they're going to absorb your energy.
They're gonna like see it.
They're gonna mirror what you're doing. So if you're gonna go into this classroom and these kids are all out of sorts because of all this trauma, the first thing you need to do is address yourself.
Right.
You need to get yourself regulated.
Right. Not only because if you're dysregulated, they'll feel it. If you're not regulated enough or not resilient in your regulation, which isn't your fault, by the way, preface that, your regulation can be compromised due to someone else's regulation. Yeah. And I think the fascinating thing about mirror neurons is the fact that, so they've done tests, and I don't know much about mirror neurons. I'm not a neuropsychiatrist. None of us are here. But the coolest thing about it is like, if I'm sitting in front of you, and you take a sip of your water, right? Mirror neurons not only are responsible for making me want to take a sip of water subconsciously, the same part of my brain that would respond to actually taking a sip of water as if I was actually doing it will light up. So it's almost like you're doing something that I'm also experiencing at the same time. Yeah. It's kind of like you decide to scratch your face, I feel the scratch. Yeah. Or maybe I don't feel it, but the same part of your brain that would feel it lights up. Yep. It's very strange, very interesting. And I think that goes back into so much that we don't know about the brain, about how we are really genuinely connected through our central nervous system, through our lizard brain, through our, even to a certain extent, our neocortex.
And I'm going to take us off on another tangent again. But it is related to this, I promise. So not only do I think like there are mirror neurons between like individuals, but growing up on a farm with animals, horses especially, that was a big one. So the person that gave me riding lessons when I was little always told me I can't get on a horse acting all dysregulated because that animal is going to absorb all my emotions. Yep. And then it is not going to be a fun ride for either of us. Right. And same thing goes like when like my horse would act up, right? I can't immediately start freaking out. I need to remain calm. Yes. And if I remain calm through the situation, chances are I'm going to be able to bring that animal back to calmness as well. But I mean, just wild that it even extends past like human interaction. Right. And I think that's like that we can take that and use it in practice.
Absolutely. 100%.
Like caregiving, you need to keep yourself calm and regulated to regulate the child. Yes. Education, you as an educator need to keep yourself calm, relaxed, whatever. And in therapy, as a therapist,
be a model for what you're trying to promote, right?
Exactly.
If you're not regulated coming into a session and you're trying to help your client, they're gonna know that you're speaking BS because what you're not practicing what you're preaching and you're not showing that it works. Right. I think that I wanted to put this in for example too, right? When you look at research amongst people who go on really higher doses of psychedelic substances, right, such as psilocybin, LSD, right?
Yep.
They respond with reports that when they're taking it with someone else who's also on a higher dose, they can legitimately consciously feel what we're talking about. Like, you know how we're saying that you come into a room, your central nervous system is already responding to someone, but you're not really, you can't always pinpoint what's going on. It's such a subconscious effect.
Right.
But on these experiences where people are really tapping into what we are theorizing to be subconscious, Carl Jungian collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, right? You are visually able to see what someone's feeling and trying to tell you. And I don't understand what that feels like, right? But it's so fascinating. I'm so excited for that research to come out.
Well, how can you research that though? Because you can't like you can't cut into people's brains. Like, I guess it's all going to be subjective research though. Because it's like, here's your experience.
Social.
Yeah.
This is where people are actually like, when they're approved for the research, they're looking at MRI brain scans while they're on deep trips, and they're seeing these parts they might be able to see these parts of their brains lit up.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That's true.
I mean, the more we understand about the brain, this is probably decades, centuries down the line.
Yeah.
I was just going to interject with, I mean, we're talking about with like mirror neurons and people interacting, right? These are most likely, I mean, obviously it's happening on a certain extent with everyone, but I'm assuming people that are more in touch and regulated, just because I think about so many people that aren't really in touch and like can walk into a room and like really consciously not know what's happening, especially I think I'm going to use like politicians as an example. I feel like a lot of politicians are like really not in touch and really not regulated, and maybe they're just all so cortisoled up that they just can't manage. But you're thinking about like them coming into a room and like reading a room, and I don't think a lot of them, I'm rambling, but I don't think a lot of them are really doing a good job of mirror neuroning or coming in regulated. And I'm making up words, but just... What do you think about people that aren't super regulated? Do you think that they're still mirror neuroning in the same way?
Absolutely.
Wait.
I just don't think they know it. Right?
I was going to say,
if you're,
it could be dissociation.
Right?
Like,
or
they don't feel
if they're
it.
coming in, they're so triggered, they're already feeling everything.
Yeah.
Right? They're just hyped. That's going to make them respond even more. To over-respond.
Are they even really engaging? I think that the mirror neurons work better on like a one-to-one.
Yes.
And are they really engaging with somebody one-to-one who is like calm and they're like mirroring them? Or are they just hyped up because they're politicians and they think they're it?
Right. I like to think of like your central nervous system, mirror neurons, whatever you want to call it, the vibe, right? As like kind of like a bowl with water, right?
Okay.
And say that one side of the bowl is more dense, or maybe it's like leaning, it's tilted, right?
Okay.
If you put more weight on the other side, it kind of balances itself out. It's looking for homeostasis. Okay. Right? So if I am super dysregulated and I'm super like in the 90 BPM, or not 90, sorry, 150, and you're like at 60, we might meet each other in the middle. Like it's always trying to like balance itself, like water will be in a moving flask or a moving bowl. This also reminds me what I was going to say earlier. There's also like, yes, you are sensitive when you're regulated, but there's also a spectrum to it. This is where we look at, I guess, some people attribute like borderline personality to this, that hyper response to the external stimuli. When we talk about reading people's faces, a lot of people might relate like, oh, I'm an empath. Like I can truly, like, usually that's really just a trauma response because you had to overread your caregiver's facial expressions.
You're walking on eggshells.
Right.
You had to be prepared.
That's something kind of different, right? Yeah. You're kind of overly sensitive to, or consciously overly sensitive to people's regulation or dysregulation because that was a survival mechanism. If you walk away from a conversation and you see yourself kind of thinking like, oh, did I like say something wrong? Even though the conversation went fine, only because you remember someone's facial features took a weird, like maybe they were like scratching their face and you interpreted that as like, oh man, maybe I should be embarrassed. Maybe I overshared, right? That is a huge indicator or a sign that you must be dealing with some complex trauma because you had to do that to your caregiver to know when they were in a good mood and you were going to be loved, or when they were in a bad mood and you were going to hopefully not be abused.
You can see how this can get kind of muddy because some parts of this ventral vagal system is reading facial expressions, but then there's also the same exact thing where it's like a trauma response. So you can see how this is really individualized.
Yes.
Where we can't really pathologize because it's really subjective and it really depends on you.
It's a spectrum. Everything's a spectrum.
Yeah.
I think that could be like a quote for life.
Yeah.
But I was actually just going to interject with, I always think back to like trauma responses and not only like people's faces and being like, oh, like I'm an empath, right? But I love the people that joke like calmly about like, oh, I can tell who's like walking up and down the stairs based on their footsteps. I'm like, what? Like they think it's like a funny, like cool thing they do, but I'm like, that's trauma. Like in most circumstances, I mean, unless you're living in a household where people have like one person is very clearly like a major stomper, the fact that you might be able to like very clearly be like, oh, that's my younger brother coming up the stairs. Like normally my brain doesn't spend a lot of time trying to differentiate what up and down the stairs sounds like for multiple people.
Sorry to cut you off. It's like, it's that protective factor, right?
Yes.
Because if you grew up in a house where distinct footsteps meant, hey, you're going to be in trouble, you're going to be abused, you're going to be verbally, physically harmed, right? You have to be on point now. You have to be aware.
Your body has to prepare early, you know, like it doesn't want to get caught off guard again like it did last time.
Yep, exactly. And that's what leads to when you become older and you hyper read people's facial expressions, thinking that you know exactly what they're feeling, and you're thinking that, oh, I know the vibe. Really, it's like, it's a trauma response. It's not, that really might not be what you think it is.
That's probably where you get those partners who are like, are you mad at me?
Yes.
I just want to make sure you're not mad at me. I'm not in trouble.
Absolutely. Now, again, this is not calling anyone out. Again, this goes right back to there's no right or wrong trauma response. This is what your brain is developed on, right? But you gave a perfect example.
But that could be a trauma response, or it could just be your temperament or your personality or your attachment style. It could be all these things. Yeah. But it's probably trauma.
It's probably trauma. I'm gonna yeah. Anyways, I don't know if you're gonna say something else.
I was just gonna say, you know, it could be supersonic hearing, but chances are.
And also, so that brings up a really good point. Like, you know, we don't want to like do things to stigmatize further or bleed into other neurodivergent communities such as ASD, right? We are seeing the research people who have ASD or even ADHD, they develop with very interesting and intricate skills, right? And that's not necessarily trauma. We don't really always know what's going on in the brain. What we're talking about right now, at least right now, is strictly trauma.
Yeah, and I think that if like one of these things start to kind of resonate with you, the way that you can kind of figure that out is you need to sit with yourself and you need to start like processing some of that.
This is not medical advice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is not medical advice, but like if some of these things resonate with you, it's up to you to decide if that's trauma, if it was trauma for you, because nobody else can tell you that it was or it wasn't. If you sit with that and it's like, man, yeah, that really feels like trauma, then that's your experience. Nobody can tell you no.
And you can take that experience and potentially find a medical
find yourself a therapist, hopefully one that's well versed in trauma.
And maybe that's something that you explore with them.
One-on-one. Explore and process. But I'm just saying like this, we can't say that, oh, if you ask your partner if you're upset with me frequently, oh, you're traumatized. It's up to you to decide that, you know?
Right.
I don't know.
If you're finding, well, actually, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to go there. Anyways.
Not medical advice.
Yes.
Still.
We are like not too over time, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
There's a couple more things I want to talk about, but I wanted to see what else you had.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just finish up with what you have.
I really wanted to take a few minutes to touch upon the adult versus childhood trauma that we mentioned earlier, neurosequential model that we touched upon, and kind of paint a clear picture of what that looks like. So last time we painted the picture of the lizard brain, the limbic brain, and the neocortex, or your human brain, right? These three different parts.
So like the automatic response, things that you can't control, the emotional part, and then the logic and reasoning part.
Right.
Just to recap.
Yeah. And there is a neurosequential model that does the same thing, but kind of adds a little bit more detail and it goes about it slightly different. I don't know who came up with it, but
it was Dr. Perry.
It was?
Yep. Dr. Perry.
Okay,
Dr.
cool.
Perry created this one, and neurosequential, like just to break it down,
Awesome.
it's just that your brain will develop in a sequence.
Yes. Yep, exactly. So like it actually mimics, or not mimics, it is going through the same order that we evolved evolutionarily. Like for example, the human species, the most evolved part of our brain is our brainstem and our lizard brain. That was the first thing that came. And then slowly we evolved to become more advanced and come out to our limbic brain and our neocortex. Just like how that evolved over thousands and thousands, hundreds of millions of years, right? That's also how you develop, right? Growing from age 0 to however old you are. Your brain comes out with the lizard brain fully developed, and it slowly starts building more neural pathways and neural connections as you grow older, and the outside brain gets more advanced as you get older. So the neurosequential model is kind of imagine it like a upside down pyramid. Split up into 4 different parts instead of 3 this time. So the bottom part, which would be the brainstem, right? This is what's ready to go. Like we said, when you're an infant, this is your central nervous system. This is your breathing regulation.
Like maybe, heart rate, like just things that you don't have to think about.
Right, because
they just go.
Right. Exactly. The next part is the diencephalon, right? And this is kind of like shared between the infant, toddler, child stage. This is more for motor regulation, sleep. There were some more that I don't quite remember.
Those are the 2 big ones, though. Right,
but those were related to the brainstem. They're kind of closely associated with them. And then you have the limbic brain, which is also closely associated, according to this model, to the diencephalon, which kind of more so is prominent within the adolescent child phase, right? This is kind of an overlap between the toddler, child, adolescent phase. This is where really your attachment and your behavior associated with attachment to your caregiver and your environment really start becoming pronounced. And then finally, the top layer, the top of the upside down pyramid is the cortex. This is your adult. This is your abstract thought, your logic. This is the last thing that develops, right? So the reason why I brought this up, and we touched upon this either in the last or the first episode, that depending on where you're traumatized, say that you're in the toddler stage and part of your brain that's really mainly developing is your limbic brain, your emotional brain, or your diencephalon, which is closely related to your brainstem, right? If you get traumatized here, and if this part is responsible for regulating your motor functions, your sleep, then and if that doesn't get resolved ASAP, right? I don't even know how to necessarily.
Whenever you're a child, you're like racing the clock, right? Because you need to get that resolved quickly, ASAP, because your brain is going to quickly develop on top of that.
Right. So if that isn't resolved, you might be dealing a lifetime with motor issues, sleep dysregulation, because that's your foundation. That's where you were traumatized. That's where you're neglected or hurt, right? So that's why when you spend your entire life with really good brain development, really healthy regulation, if you're severely traumatized at 25 years old, it's nowhere nearly as bad as slightly to moderately traumatized at 3 or 4.
Right, because you have all of those other all those other systems or those other layers that have already developed. So you're good. You got a good foundation at 25.
Absolutely.
You're not good, but you're better off.
Yes, 100%.
But if you're a kid,
this is subjective, it's unique, but like this is generally how the brain development goes.
Right.
In its relationship with trauma. I don't know if I went on for a while. I don't know if there was any part that didn't make any sense.
No, it makes sense to me, but that's because I know this model.
No, it was really easy to follow along, and I was kind of thinking in terms of visuals, almost like, a house, right? It would be really, really bad if you did not pour a solid foundation, and everything that is built on top of that is now at risk. But if you get all the way done and then you accidentally hang a door incorrectly,
fine.
That's probably fine. That's fixable. You do a little work, or maybe a door is too minuscule. But I think that's where I was going with that is, as long as we start with the good stuff, and if any issues, we get those fixed right away. By the time I get to the door hanging or the curtain rod hanging, I'm projecting there.
No,
we have, I think, an easier problem or, solution.
Yeah. I think
thing.
that's a really good example.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Perfect.
So yeah, I just wanted to say that real quick. I'm sure we can go deeper in this model in the future. We're going to learn more as we revisit our material, our coursework material.
One more thing that we could add to that is that like the more stressful experiences you have, the quicker you are going to turn on.
Yes.
Your I guess I should say your sympathetic nervous system will turn on. So you're going to react to stress way faster.
Yeah, because you have more adrenaline receptors.
Yes.
You develop with them.
Yes. And you're going to be more likely to store the trauma.
Right.
Because it's already stored. It already knows.
The way I remember looking back at our course material is like, say that you get traumatized as a toddler when you're regulating sleep or whatever, and say that you don't process it, right? When you are an adolescent and you go through some major stressors, those stressors, again, if they're not resolved, will contribute to the trauma of sleep dysregulation. It'll find a way to become a bigger blob that'll add to it, if that makes sense.
Yes. This is like we're like always teasing about CPTSD, but this is like a good way for you to kind of conceptualize, whoever's listening, that if you're having developmental trauma, like you can see how it can compound very easily. And like the more things you're experiencing, you're just adding more to this pile.
Yes.
It's just like you're quicker to respond, you're quicker to store. And so every little thing is just compounding, and you're still trying to develop this brain.
Yeah.
So you're kind of in like a shitstorm.
Right. 100%. 100%.
So
another thing I wanted to clarify. I think it just left my brain as soon as I started talking. It was some feedback we were getting on TikTok about complex trauma. A lot of people are commenting and asking if complex trauma and childhood trauma are the same or different, right? So yes, you can have childhood trauma, usually is complex, right? And that isn't the only time you could get complex trauma.
Yeah.
A lot of people are talking about, can I get complex trauma when I'm a teenager or an adult?
Yeah.
Of course you can.
Complex trauma just basically means like more than one traumatic experience.
It's just really common for children.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So they usually say like
during childhood.
Developmental trauma for kids, and then CPTSD is kind of like
all encompassing.
All right, you've had a lot of stuff.
Yeah, right.
You're more than just PTSD. We're gonna give you an extra letter.
Right.
I'm just thinking of it in like layman's terms, I guess, like with childhood trauma normally being complex, and because you talked about like all the different ways that the brain builds on top of each other, right? So I'm imagining like a 2 or 3 year old's brain that's trying to develop, and now all of a sudden like they have inconsistent caregivers, and or the parents decide to split, and now they have another traumatic experience at like one caregiver's house, and then they're coming back to another inconsistent caregiver's house and bouncing back and forth between that. And then you put them in a school system and they're not receiving any like baseline like regulation or care there. Now we've got like 4 years of really inconsistent caregiving and trauma on top of each other while that brain is moving at like light speed to develop. I'm gonna assume most of that's complex.
I think you're seeing the realities here.
Absolutely.
Because that's not an uncommon story.
Yeah.
So
and as we know, trauma isn't just what we're describing in the brain. It is also heavily and highly like correlated to your environmental factors, your socioeconomic status, your sociocultural factors. Everything kind of feeds
like
into
systemic, you know, like there's lots of systemic stuff too. We haven't even talked about like racial trauma or religious trauma,
we haven't
or
even
like
talked about how that goes down through generations, because
generational trauma. Yes, it does.
But we can go on.
What I'm hearing is you guys, I'm not signing myself up for some of those, but you guys are gonna have to do a lot of special episodes on some different types of trauma, because I have no idea how you're gonna tie all of that into one singular episode. So
we'll do it bit by bit.
Yeah.
So
I always like to tell my clients, how do you eat a pizza? One bite at a time.
Absolutely. So what else do we have to cover? We are 20 minutes over time.
Yeah, I think we should remind you to put in regulate to put if you have a question that's burning after this podcast or has been burning for the last 2, send us a DM or write in our anonymous one this week, and we'll answer it.
That is TRAUMADELIC therapy on Instagram. Okay. Well, thank you both of you guys so much again. It is wonderful to have an outside perspective. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Anna.
And my name is Omer.
I'm Becca.
And I'm Anna.
Oh, wait, were you about to say something else? Sorry.
I don't remember what I was going to say. I had something, but it's gone.
I'm so sorry.
We'll bring it back for the next one.
It's the ADHD in us. I apologize. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Tune into the next episode. I don't know what we're talking about yet, but probably more advanced stuff.
I bet it's going to be something about trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. DM us your questions, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. If you made it this far, thank you so much, and hope you have a wonderful day. Don't forget to wash your hands.
Don't forget to wash your hands.
And we'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.